And it's good Wednesday afternoon. It is December 16th, 1:02 p.m. My name is Ryan Belmore. I'm the owner and publisher of What's Up, Newp. And we are back here with another in our series, another interview in our author series. And joining me as the organizer of this is our own Frank Proslitz. And hey, Frank, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing all right. And we are chatting with the authors this holiday season.
It's been great, and maybe I'll put something together for the website. List all of those authors that we've talked to, and hopefully encourage people to go and take a look at what they're writing. Wide variety of stuff, and some incredibly talented people.
And that brings us to a good point. Tomorrow, we're actually going to be chatting with Steve Iwanowski from Charter Books, who has sponsored this series. And on his website, he actually has a roundup of all the authors we have talked to.
Oh, great.
And all of the books you can purchase. And we're actually going to be chatting with Steve tomorrow about Charter Books, which is opening at 8 Broadway here in Newport. Brand new bookstore, lots of history. But they're opening 8 Broadway next year. So they're not quite open yet. But what you can do is, you can see right there at the top, is there's still time to do some priority ground shipping, and you can also do free local delivery or in-store pickup. If you're here in Newport, you can do curbside pickups at the storefront between 11 and 4, Mondays through Fridays. And you still have some time through the end of today for priority ground shipping and expedited shipping. So charterbookstore.com, and we want to thank him for sponsoring this series, because we were doing this without a sponsor just because we love chatting with authors. And now here we are, and we have a sponsor. And now we can tell them exactly where to go for the books, and Steve can help you find the books. So who are we going to be chatting with today, Frank?
We're going to be chatting with Ed Delaney. Ed Delaney is an award-winning author, journalist, filmmaker, playwright, and educator. He's a teacher at Roger Williams University. He is the author of several books, including novels, Broken Irish, Warp and Weft, and Follow the Sun, short story collection, The Drowning, and other stories, The Big Impossible, and looking down here, he's also co-author of Born to Play by Boston Red Sox second baseman Dustin Pedroia. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. He's written a play called The Umbrella Man, premiered at the Pittsburgh Playhouse in 2010. Faculty member at Roger Williams, and it's great to have him on board today.
It is. And, Ted, is there anything else that we need to mention now?
You covered it well. Thank you.
All right. See you later.
Hey, so Ted, I just want to make sure you were born at an early age, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
yes.
Good. All right. Got that right.
That's always funny.
Hey, what am I going to tell you? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you strictly a novelist? How many books have you written? And what got you interested in writing?
Sure. Yeah, I am interested in all kinds of creative work and have been a writer for a long time. I got to fiction writing well into my career. I didn't start writing fiction until I was in my 30s, but I had started out in journalism. So I was a newspaper guy, and I worked at papers down near Miami, Atlanta. I ended up out in Colorado, worked for the Denver Post and the Colorado Springs Gazette. And during that time, I got to do what I found was that covering things like City Hall was of less interest to me than writing stories about people. And so I had some great editors in Colorado who turned me loose and let me do those kinds of stories. And it sort of led me to the interest in fiction. I think there was a long time where it never occurred to me to try writing fiction because the journalism lent itself to those kinds of stories. But I began writing short stories and began publishing fairly immediately because I was a fairly new writer when it came to fiction, but I'd gotten that 10-year apprenticeship doing journalism, and I felt like it was not as tough a transition maybe as someone starting from a completely different field or something like that. So began publishing in magazines, The Atlantic, and a lot of these little literary magazines that put a platform there for authors, and eventually began to do book length. So I've published 5 books of fiction and spanning 1999 to 2019. And as Frank mentioned, I did that co-authorship, which was really a hired gig to be the writer, the co-author for Dustin Pedroia. But that was fun. It was a different experience. And so I've done lots of other things too creatively. I make documentary films, which often have a subject of literature. And I do a certain amount of nonfiction. So it's just, it's a writing life. It's just enjoyable to try a lot of different types of writing and see where it goes.
Oh, how many nonfiction books have you done?
No nonfiction books, but I did
Okay.
a lot of magazine pieces. Now I may be I'm working on a nonfiction project right now. Who knows whether that is an assortment of nonfiction pieces with a kind of a binding element to them, or whether there's a book in there. That remains to be seen. But it's kind of fun to do. It's a little bit different. But I wrote a lot of magazine pieces. I've written for all kinds. And early on, before the Providence Journal discontinued their Sunday magazine, I got to write a lot for them and did a lot of really fun pieces for the Journal at that time.
What from journalism to fiction? How big a transition was that? And did you have to give up some of your? I guess it's a dedication to being absolutely talking about what is for real, as opposed to talking about what you'd like people to think is for real.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of people, when they write fiction, base it on their own lives. But I think that coming in from journalism, it made me someone who writes about other people. I've never written anything in fiction that has anything to do with my own life in a direct way. Now, it certainly has to do with my life in terms of my interests, my concerns, and people I know. But I think that to some degree, that was that move from the magazine writing, because, I'd do a piece in which I would try to kind of drill down into what someone was going through in a given situation. And people will often tell you what they're going through. But on one hand, it may be not totally true. People protect themselves. People are, even often people don't want to be that vulnerable to give out that kind of personal kind of, information. But the second part of it is often, as we all know from new novels and movies and everything else, is that often people do things without completely understanding why they're doing it. And so when I was doing journalism, I had the responsibility or the obligation to the subject of the piece to characterize them only as the facts could characterize them. But I often kind of went back and thought, I bet I know what's really going on with that person. Fiction gives you that opportunity to move away from that, because you're not writing about that person. It may be a character that's somewhat based on that person, and you can kind of get underneath it and really try to get to the heart of human motivation, which is the thing that interests me the most.
Where do you draw your story lines from, your motivation a little bit, and also subject matter?
Sure. Initially, a lot of it came from the journalism. And even some of the stories I've published in my most recent book go all the way back to some of the journalism I did in the 90s and even in the 80s. There's a novella in the most recent book, it's Big Impossible. I have it right there. But with the Big Impossible, it's a novella that basically deals with essentially an itinerant. And that began when I did a series in newspapers years ago about these migrant workers in Colorado out west, traveling with the harvest. And it stuck in my head and it stayed with me. My first novel is based in Fall River, although the novel never says it's in Fall River, but the book is called Warp and Weft. It's about a textile mill. And I'm from Fall River. And in the summers, I worked at the mills. And, it's not my story, but it's a story about the people that I saw and tried to understand their lives and what those were about.
Are you trying to convey a message or tell I love historical novels, and they put me in a point in time, but then I'm able to get into the emotions of the particular period, because the writer has that kind of license to do that. Are you doing that with your novels?
Not as much. I will say I love historical fiction, and I absolutely appreciate how they illuminate history using characters. And sometimes part of it is we're trying to understand which part is the imaginary part and which part is the real part. But I think that that kind of blend of things can really go in a lot of different directions. What I tell my students is that while it becomes a staple of the high school or college English class to kind of try to figure out what the author's message is, quote unquote, I'm not sure that a message should be the most important thing. I think a story is the most important thing. And I think that when you tell a story, you're telling it because something is there in you that wants you to tell it, even if you don't completely consciously understand why you are. And then the reader can take from that what they want. So in a sense, I think sometimes, and there are certainly lots of authors who write what you might perceive as a message novel. But I think a lot of authors, you really have to start by telling just a good story. And that's where most of the effort goes. And then hopefully there'll be something coming out of it that a reader will take from that.
Interestingly, we've done now half a dozen or so authors. And the common thread, because I always ask that question about a message, and I always get the same answer, basically, that authors are storytellers. And even if it's nonfiction, it's you're telling a story, and that becomes the primary goal.
Again, I tell the students, think of why you may tell a story. And I don't mean in writing, I mean sitting in the cafeteria at lunchtime or, in a social gathering or something like that. Sometimes those stories you tell because they just stick with you. And if you really pushed yourself to say, why is that story so interesting to me? You might not fully understand. So something that happened years ago, you might come up and you'll say, let me tell you about something that happened to me, without it having a very clear kind of thesis, if you will. And I think sometimes those are the very best pieces of work.
What are you teaching at Roger Williams?
Creative writing. So I started out, I've been there since 1990. And so I started out as a journalism professor. And at that point, I had written no fiction, began writing fiction, began getting published. And eventually I became a joint appointment between the journalism and creative writing programs. And then about 10 years ago, I went fully over to creative writing. And so I still love journalism and I always enjoyed teaching it. But it's the storytelling aspect that I think I love most about what I'm doing now.
Ted, I have your books in front of me here, and I was wondering if you could just kind of give us a short story on each of them and who might want to pick up what and, why they might want to pick them up or who would be a perfect gift for.
Sure. I will go, I'll go reverse chronology and say that my most recent book, Turtle Point Press, Brooklyn, New York, who've been great to me. The book is called The Big Impossible Novellas+Stories. And one of the things about stories and novellas is that they are not particularly commercial. You don't write it to try to get a big audience. Things like romance, mystery, those things naturally gather a bigger audience. To some degree, for the author, that allows you to write something that you're looking at as being kind of purely aesthetic. You're just trying to do your best work. And so I think these are stories that I've done over a lot of years. Some I've had in some larger magazines, some in some smaller, and just stories that were important for me to tell. And so, if you like that kind of thing, it's funny because I think we all know that the short story as a form has fallen off in the last 30, 40 years. They used to be such a staple of all the big magazines. But I love short stories and I love reading them. And I think that to some degree, I don't understand why people don't, because you can sit down and get that full experience in one sitting, as opposed to the long novel where you have to kind of break the experience up into pieces. Some of the stories are if you want to call them local, they're in New England, and some of the stories are out west. Which some people who reviewed the book were surprised at, but that was part of my journalism experience living in Colorado for almost a decade and traveling all over. when I was there. So that kind of brings that to bear with this book. Follow the Sun. It's an interesting experience with that one because so much of publishing and it goes toward this idea of genres. And part of what's made that happen is Amazon, in the sense that everything's got to be in a category. You know, you can't just write a book. It's got to be on a particular shelf or under a certain heading. And so when I did Follow the Sun, which is about basically a lobsterman who goes missing, I wrote a story that I wanted to tell. And it was interesting in some of the reviews and even some of the listings, you know, Amazon, et cetera, they called it a mystery. And to some degree, I wasn't thrilled with that because mysteries, as we all know, the true mystery novel follows a very definitive path. And so I worried that someone who's a mystery fan might be disappointed, read this book and say, well, that's not a mystery like mysteries work. And someone who is more on the literary side might forego it because they would say, well, I don't read mysteries. And so I, you know, if someone likes literary with an element of a question to be answered, shall we say, I don't want to call it a mystery, that might be the one to go with. The book previous to that, 2011, it was my most successful book in terms of sales, reviews, and everything else. All of these with Turtle Point Press. And Broken Irish was a book that on some levels dug down into the scene in South Boston in particular. It's not, people view it as a South Boston book, and it is, but it goes beyond that, I think. And so part of that is trying on some level, I guess, to capture some of the things going on in certain kind of social stratas, shall we say, that Boston scene. And so that book, it did really well. I sometimes wonder if some books are doing less well than they would have, not because of any other factor except fewer people seem to be reading books. But boy, I got a lot of response on that. And so that's the one, I guess, if there's one book based on track record that I'd recommend, it would be that. Going to the two before that, Warp and Weft was a Mill novel I mentioned, and that was published by a small publisher in New York called Permanent. And I, you know, it again, review-wise, sales-wise, a little more modest, but got some recognition for it, which I was happy for. And The Drowning, my first book, that was that sort of novice effort of doing a book that collected the first stories that I'd been publishing. That book doesn't have a single thematic connection in any way. It's just a lot of stories I wrote. And to some degree, I think when we start writing, and again, I tell my students this, we're trying all kinds of different things. So I think you'll find a lot of different kinds of stories in there. Ironically, the title story, The Drowning, is something of, I guess, a mystery in the way that others might define it. And that story did pretty well for me. So that's the oeuvre.
Talk about your evolution as a writer from that first novel to now, and how have you grown and how have you changed?
I think that I've changed in the sense that the earlier work is much more documentary, you know, mentioning that journalism background, that observation of people. I think that I was maybe a little less comfortable jumping into the kind of interior lives that people have. And so initially, I think everything was a little more external in that way. And as I went along, I think I began to really kind of try to get underneath the surface more with the work I've done more lately. I was mentioning that I did a number of documentary films. I did one which was about the author Andre Dubus. He, not to be confused with his son, Andre Dubus III, who's also a very successful writer. But Andre Dubus was a very complicated guy, and doing the film about him and talking to people about his writing, I think was a real illuminating experience that changed my writing to some degree, because it talked about how, in some ways, when you write a character, you have to figure out what part of you resides in that character. Sometimes you have protagonists and antagonists. And if you say, well, the protagonist, I understand completely, it's just like me. But with the antagonist, what is it about that person? As much as I view that person in a negative light, do I share characteristics with? And I think that those kinds of discoveries, if you want to call it that, have a lot to do with how the writing comes out.
You
I think I
mentioned
like
go ahead,
documentary.
Brian.
Frank, you'll like this one. The documentary he worked on. Dad is a idiot. The literature of advertising.
That's about it. Well, and that's one I'll talk about just in a nutshell. That was an interesting little project because it only screened one time at this big advertising conference years ago. But the basic premise was how, and I'm sad to say this in a way, that when we watch television and those ads are these tiny little dramas, very few ads say to us, here's a product, here's why it's good. You should buy it. Most of them tell a story. You have characters and families. And if you understand that the primary driving force between all those stories is that they're trying to get you to buy a product, it helps you look at it in a different light. But the title, The Dad is an Idiot, is, advertising does that all the time, in which dad is sort of the straw man, if you will, for the smarter people, whether it be the spouse, the kids, whoever, to make the wise buying choice. So there's a lot of, but that's our American culture, learning about culture through watching ads. The Demise project was, kind of getting into the head of a writer in some way. The third documentary I did, which still does well. I mean, I did it 10 years ago, but I still get a lot of views on it. I sell it online. It's called Library of the Early Mind. It's about children's literature, and that helped too. I interviewed probably about 40 children's authors of all kinds of levels of fame and success, and talking to people about how you write a story for a child doesn't necessarily hurt us when we're writing stories for grownups. And since I'm mentioning, you also mentioned, Frank, in that bio, the play I did, which I don't consider it a great success. It didn't go as well as I'd hoped. And part of that is when you move into collaboration, you've got to work with a lot of people, and the vision that you might have begins to dissipate. But one thing I brought out of that experience was dialogue, learning to write dialogue better, really trying to tell a story with people talking. So, every experience, whether it went well or didn't go well, kind of leads to where you are as a writer at any given moment.
A dialogue is something that I view as something fairly difficult. I'm reading a book now. I won't mention the name because I may not read it much longer, where I can't tell the difference if I closed my eyes and didn't and heard these characters. I couldn't tell you the difference from one to the other.
Yeah,
you've
got to find ways to make
it's crazy. How do you do that, and how do you keep track of all of that?
In terms of how do I keep track of
the character of a character maintaining a particular particular style?
Sure.
And sure. I can see myself halfway through mixing them all up.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I guess it's funny because I remember I tell this story sometimes. Again, these are all stories I tell my students from time to time. And I remember years ago I was on assignment as a journalist and met with and was having dinner with a number of other journalists, and someone asked me, do you ever have any interest in writing fiction? And I said, I don't see ever doing that. Well, why not? And the answer was because it's hard to write a character who is not real and believe they're real. But what I learned as I moved into fiction is, but you have to believe they're real. You have to learn to see those people as real people, otherwise a reader will not. And so part of that certainly is writing a character in which you understand why they're different from others, what their little quirks and mannerisms are. And then the other part, which I think is what so many of us do, is we think of people we know who have a way with words. Someone who's especially quotable, who we might know in real life, and you try to bring a little of that flavor into it.
I want to go back a little bit. And what got you into journalism in the first place?
It was a funny journey. And I think that the real answer is I love telling stories. But the long, not the long story, I'll keep it short, but the long kind of transition was I was a business major in college, and I did it because I thought it was practical. Just this will get me a job. I hated it. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. Let's put it that way. And it was never inspiring to me. But then I got out of school and I decided, well, I better keep doing. So I went to graduate school at Boston University, but I'd started out in the MBA program, the business program. And a professor there got me interested in advertising. And that, to me, now we're telling some stories. Now we're being creative, but it still is under that little umbrella of being practical. You can get a job in it. I couldn't even have imagined at the time how to be a creative writer, a novelist, or anything like that, and actually earn a living. So I wanted to get a job and be able to support myself. And so by the time I finished graduate school, I was all fired up to do advertising. And I went to Atlanta, where I was looking for a job just because there was a recession and Atlanta had a good employment market. And I just went down there to see what I could find. And after interviewing with a bunch of different places, I interviewed with IBM, and the guy there for their PR department, the guy said, if you went and worked for a newspaper for 1 year and then you came back with that on your resume, I'd hire you. So my first year in a newspaper in Atlanta, in this little weekly paper, was just to get that IBM job. And once I get into it, I never looked back. I loved it. It was like, it was just that idea. Wait a minute, I can tell stories and get paid for it. Even if they're other people's stories, that's fine. So that was this weird kind of, never saw myself as being a writer of fiction. Loved reading fiction, but never saw myself writing it.
What do you consider the best news story that you did as a reporter?
Well, this goes toward, it's almost like a novel, the story. So as you know, just seeing how the journalism business has evolved, there's almost no space to put anything in anymore. Every story has to be so short. But at the time I was working in journalism, which was through the 80s, and especially in places like Colorado where the economy was booming, there was tons of space to fill. And, lots of advertising, creating lots of pages to fill. And the editors I worked with wanted people to find ways of telling bigger stories. And that meant writing a lot of series, a lot of special projects. And so I ended up doing a piece. This was at the Colorado Springs Gazette, where my great editor, Jim Bishop, God rest his soul, just really kind of brought everybody into this way of writing. I did a 1-year project on the Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind. Now, I was still doing my everyday job, but that was kind of the deal. Like, we'll let you go do these things on your own time, but we have the space to print it. So it ended up being almost a book-length piece, following the teachers, the students, parents, all through the academic year and trying to tell their stories. And that was by far my favorite piece of journalism I ever did.
Doing those long-term pieces always force you to be a better researcher and a reporter, and then to try and put it all into some kind of a succinct way that readers are going to be able to understand it is a real challenge.
Yeah, and beyond that, you got to have a storyline. You have to give readers a reason to keep turning the page or picking up the next installment of the series.
So you mentioned that you thought that I'm trying to see the fewer people are reading books is what you would mention. I suspect that fewer people are reading, period. When you take a look at the demise of print journalism, and while there's a growth of the stuff that we do on the internet, it's different. Their stories tend to be shorter. There's not a lot of that investigative journalism that went on. Seems to me that there's a loss of readership in a lot of those ways.
It's a tricky thing, and I'll add one more thing. And here's my joke that I was just telling my wife. I said, I've been having trouble sleeping over these last few months, but what finally solved it? The Electoral College. And so part of that is that politics has eaten up our attention for almost 4 years now. Now, books were already, when you go to the beach or get on a plane or ride on the train to New York, what you used to see is people with books, and now you see people on their phones. It's inevitable. It's just what's happened. And so what that means is that people who might have been, in my opinion, just my opinion, people who might have been marginal readers, those kinds of people who read the book on a train because there's nothing else to do, those people have fallen off. The good news for writers, I think, is that the people who've hung in there are people who really care about the written word, about storytelling in that way. And so I think that there was a decline there. I think, as I say, the last 4 years, our attention has been almost hijacked in a way by all that's happening. And I found what I found, you were mentioning, Frank, that you were reading historical novels. I've been reading a lot of history of late, just straight up history. And so part of that is escapism. I think as, hopefully things get onto a more normal plane again, people will start looking for that story that goes beneath just the anger of the headlines. Whether people care to read at length, I think that has to do a lot with how we write books. We can't, books are so different. And again, things I tell my students all the time, which is you've got to give someone that short-term reward. I'm a huge believer, and you'll see this in any of my work, particularly my novels. A chapter to me should never be more than about 1,500 words. Like, I never write a 4,000 word chapter because you don't want to allow someone to say, oh, I'm kind of tired, I'll shut the book now. Let them complete something and come back for more. And I think that you have to kind of learn to some degree how to tell stories in an age when our attention is constantly being interrupted.
Do you think that, and I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of, I'm a longtime journalist,
right.
And I thought, really, I don't really care how something is delivered, but I care how it is gathered. I care about the journalism, and it doesn't matter whether it's in print, whether it's on TV, whether it's over the internet, as long as it gets delivered in a place where people can actually can read it and absorb it. And I feel that we're in that transition now as print falls away, that we are becoming much better at doing things on the internet. I think What's Up Newp does a great job, and I think we're doing a lot of things that even when we started out, Ryan, a few years ago when I started out with you, we're doing things that we didn't do then, and we're doing them better as we move along.
It also, I think part of it is the way that we adapt. And so part of it is, I love a physical book. My house is full of them. I also, my rule of thumb is when a book is more than about 600 pages, I often get it on Kindle just because of the heavy book on your chest while you're reading. But the thing I found myself doing, and this is particularly with history, is, I guess what I don't know what the term for this is. I'm sure everyone does it, but I call it online footnoting. So I'm reading a book. And even like, I just read the JFK biography that just came out, which is excellent. It's a really good book. And as much as that book is 900 pages, there's so much more. You could do a 10,000 page book with all it, is available. So I find myself, when I come across a name and it mentions very briefly, I put the book down, I go to Wikipedia, I look up who that person is, I read about them, I find an article, I read another. Pretty soon I'm circling back to the book. So the 900 page book takes a month to read because I've augmented that book with all these other hours of getting deeper into the story, which it's just my nature. I like doing it. But the idea that when you do a book between covers, that doesn't limit the reader to only being availed of your information or what you put in it.
It's like linking in an online story.
I'm sorry, say it again.
It's like linking to another story, when we're doing an online story, it's hyperlinking.
Absolutely. And, that was something where early on when all this was going on, the question for a lot of journalists was, do you put link, like if we're at the Providence Journal, why would we link to a story that makes you leave the Providence Journal and go to a competitor? But I think that argument was put aside years ago. And so part of it is that when you open a, piece of writing, New York Times, Washington Post, whatever, and you see all those links, it promises you a more expansive story, and it shows that the author wants you to kind of get a bigger understanding, and I appreciate that.
Ted, if you were to characterize your novels, mystery novels, how would you characterize yourself as a writer?
Yeah, I think all of us end up doing something that we either do better or things that just preoccupy us. And, one of the things that you find early on as a writer is sometimes the market dictates that. So some things I wrote early on never got accepted for publication, but other things did. And I thought, well, I guess I'm better at this. But if there were a single thing that I were going to kind of focus on in terms of what I'm interested in as a writer, it's this. It's what people do for work and how that relates to who they are and how their work changes who they are. So I don't do, for the most part, well, I do to some degree. You dig down into family things and all that, but it starts, like I say, my first novel was about people working in a mill. My next novel was about lobstermen, and a lot of my story, The Drowning, that first book, the primary story is about a priest and how he has to kind of make decisions based on being that. So I think I tend to go for that more than a lot of people. And I think that sometimes it's interesting to me in some fiction, including a lot of fiction that I really like, where you'll read about a character and it might say, well, so-and-so is an art dealer, but you never see that. And it's sort of just like you're getting a resume item as opposed to seeing how that makes that person's life work and why they do what they do, which is always of interest to me.
The connection between work and the novel, I think very much of Studs Terkel and his great book, Working.
Oh God. Yeah. That is, that book is, you can just sit and that goes to, I recommend that book to students who want to think about dialogue, because each voice is so incredibly different and each voice tells a story in a way that voice can tell a story. And I absolutely agree. And of course, with The Good War, was that the World War II book he did? It's called The Good War, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. And so he, amazing work.
Yeah. And there's a former journalist at work, if you will, in Studs Terkel.
Absolutely.
What's next for you?
Working on new stuff. That's the other thing, going back to the question you asked me about, where I've gone as a writer. I've been lucky enough to get books published, and it's been a happy thing. And it's always nice, even though I'm not a bestseller by any means, when people read your book and feel like they got something out of it. But the real joy is just doing the work, and so I'm working on fiction. I'm working on nonfiction. I don't usually say much about it because the direction can turn at any time as something might become of interest. And I'm actually, I'm lucky right now in a lot of ways that this semester, with all this going on with the pandemic, I'm on sabbatical, which I had to apply for, like 2 years ago. And so it just so happened, my dumb luck, that I've been able to kind of, shelter in place here in my basement office here. And it's just been great. I've just been writing and writing. And what of that sees the light of day? What of it I reject? What of it, I change as it goes along? That's kind of the joy of doing it.
Excellent. I'm going to give out your website here one more time if anybody wants to read up more about your books, documentary films, and a whole lot more is up on that website, and people can get in touch with you as well on the website. So we appreciate it. We wish you the very best of luck with whatever may come out of this sabbatical, and whatever. Hopefully something comes out of it. Yeah,
I'm all the work's right here. I've been working all morning. We'll see where it goes. We always just see where it goes. But thank you both. I really appreciate it, and your questions.
Well, we appreciate you coming on, and once again, it demonstrates, I think, to folks in this area, we've got a lot of really talented people who are doing some great things.
It's amazing who you run into and you didn't even realize was living right up the street. Some great writers out there.
Yeah.
That's it. All right, Ted. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Okay,
Ted.
thank you.
All right, Mr. Prosnitz. There we go. My computer froze up there for a minute.
All right.
But yes, let me give website one more time in case people missed it, and you can find out about the 5 books that we talked about, as well as some of the documentary films and a whole lot more right up there on his website.
Seems like a talented guy, and we'll put up. I'm excited about us having a sponsor for this. We're going to continue doing authors as we go along. Probably do a little hiccup around Christmas time because some of them even like to celebrate. But we're hoping to get Corey Dean on, a science writer, soon, and a whole bunch of others. It's been a lot of fun.
And tomorrow at 1:00, we'll actually talk to the owner of a bookstore, and that is Charter Books, which is opening at 8 Broadway for those in Newport, the former Hope, right across from Fastnet Pub. And we'll talk to him about who decides to open a bookstore during a pandemic and who decides to open a bookstore these days. And we'll
exactly.
hear more about it tomorrow at 1. We'll be joined by Steve from Charter Books, and you could shop his bookstore now, pick up, delivery, shipping, good things like that. So, all right, Mr. Prosnitz, till tomorrow at 1.
Very good. See you then.
Thank you for watching.